the words of our mouths and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please. So anybody got $50 they'll loan me? It should be yes. I should be getting lots of yeses after what Jesus said, right? I made a choice. We're going to try something a little different today. It's something I do more commonly at the 8 o'clock and the 5 o'clock. Last week I came out here and I joked. I said, anybody want to preach, right? And you all laughed at me. Because you didn't. It was a hard passage. We've been working through the Sermon on the Mount now for a month, and we're really just in the beginning of it. There's much more. But as Epiphany comes to a close, we won't be continuing down that particular track, and we'll be moving into Lent. But there's been a lot of hard stuff we've been talking about and trying to make sense of. And one of the things we have a habit of doing at 8 o'clock and 5 o'clock is inviting the community to reflect on what they're hearing. So I'm going to give you a moment, and I want you to look at the gospel reading in particular. And I want you to look and see if there's a phrase in there which, one, you either find particularly challenging. And I'm going to invite you to share this with the group. Two, you find particularly interesting, something that you feel like your life is being called to strive more towards after having heard it. Or three, you just have a question about and you don't understand. And I'm going to invite you to share that with the group so together we can have a conversation. So you got 30 seconds. All right, 15 seconds. You're fine now. And you can keep looking. And I'm going to share with you one story before we begin down that road. And don't worry, if you don't say too much, I have plenty of things to say to you. Members of the choir, we include you in this. You can shout down from on high and be a part of this conversation. George Carey, who's a writer, a commentator who wrote about this passage, he shared a story about his daughter. One day he stumbled into the kitchen after a long day of work. He put down his groceries and pressed the voicemail button, and it was his 10-year-old, his daughter Erin, and she said, "Dad, I'm the lector at church on Sunday, and I have that passage where Jesus says, 'Turn the other cheek.' You know that passage, right? Do the other Gospels have that same passage? Is it different in the other Gospels? Could you let me know? Because, well, no offense, Dad, but I think Jesus is wrong." And I think that's some of the pressure of the Sermon on the Mount, right? We get over and over all of this stuff which doesn't quite seem like the way the world works. And yet this is what Jesus is inviting us into. And so I'm curious where you're feeling that pressure, that God might be speaking to you about where we're supposed to be acting and living, and you're feeling challenged by it or encouraged by it. Anybody? Interesting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Bernie was talking about the experience of people coming. You know, Bernie, of course, works at the parish as well, and the sense of people who come and there's a way in which you wonder, you know, are they taking advantage of the system? Are they really, shouldn't they be working through organizations that are better suited to help them, right? And that there's a part of her, she acknowledged, she said, I don't really want to give to them, right? I think thank you for that, very honest, right? I know I feel that way. Sometimes you walk down the street, and especially when you're wearing a collar downtown, and you feel like a target, right? I mean, people assume you're going to give to them exactly the way they want you to give to them, which is an interesting pressure point on that question, right? It says give. It doesn't say give exactly the way they ask to be given to, right? One way faithful Christians, of course, engage with that in this day and age, a lot of them is sometimes they'll carry around, if you go work downtown or in a place where this happens a lot, food. You'll have granola bars with you. And they ask you for help, and you have a granola bar to give them, and you don't have the question of what's going to happen to that money, right? So there are faithful ways, I think, to do this that honor the intention. But what I really appreciated Bernie sharing was that feeling of there's a part of me that doesn't really want to, right? That wonders and is afraid they're going to either be taking advantage of me, right? Or that something's going to happen, or I can't give it to somebody who really needs it, right? And so that fear, I think, is just a part of us walking through the world, and a sense of us often wondering, do we really have enough to do all the things God's given us to do? And trying to be good stewards of what we've been given, so the pressure of that. And my own struggle with that is there as well. And Bernie knows that we have those conversations with people, and one of our answers is, well, we do want to give to you, and we want to give to you through the organizations we support who can do more with the money that we have available to that, right? So, but even then I wonder, how much are we living faithfully into what God invites us in this passage? And I think we all struggle with it. Mary? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, so Mary was, for those of you who didn't hear her well, of course, talking about that idea of loving those who aren't like us, right? And he goes further, those who persecute us, right? Those who actively seek to harm us are people we're called to love, into that challenge. And in part, there's maybe an invitation for our own ability to grow as a person when we're able to see that. And think about the world we live in today, right? I mean, more and more we isolate ourselves in these little groups where we talk mainly to people who think like us. And so our views are reinforced. And because of that, we get very polarized positions, and we're not even really able to talk to each other in meaningful ways anymore. And I think it's one of the gifts of communities like this where we sit with people who have a diversity of views on a number of issues in this room. Let's just be honest, right? And that's okay, because we also recognize that the one truth that we share is that Jesus Christ is the one whose life we want to follow. And we might not all understand that the same way, but we all want to support one another in the journey of faith we've been given in this life. And because we're able to be together despite always agreeing on things, it enriches us and provides us a better way to be a witness to that. It is a difficult thing to think about. You think about that shooting in 2006 with the Amish, right? Do you remember that? So somebody went into a school and shot and killed 5 children. And the immediate response of that community was awe-inspiring. It was to forgive right away, immediately, that we cannot hate this person. That's not who we're called to be. They even set up a scholarship fund for that family. The family of the man who killed the children, right? The Amish set up a scholarship for his family to support them. And you see that, and honestly, if that happened to me, I don't know how I would react. I honestly wonder that. And I pray that God would give me the grace to respond with the kind of passion and courage they had for the gospel when they did. But in that, we just see the incredible truth that this stuff, which can feel so impossible, when we have communities of support and we really hold it deep within us, incredible things can be a part of life in the world we're in. And what a witness that was to the power of love. They refused to respond to hate with hate, right? Something similar Martin Luther King says. He says, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. But that doesn't mean it's easy to do, right? It takes something from us to do that, to have to give up that sense of wanting to have revenge or the cost of that. There's a hand, Bob? Yeah, I was an attorney. Uh-oh. Yeah. This is not the logic of the world, right? Over and over, this sermon is not expressing a way to live that makes sense with the way we relate according to the terms of the world we're a part of. Jesus through this is inviting us to see something different and to claim some small part of it, right? To be some small part of making it more real in the world than it was before. John? Post-traumatic stress. Yeah. 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 And how do we do it with love, right? The difference, I think, when we interact with people, whether or not you give them a granola bar or some money or walk them somewhere if they want to get some food and do that, or can just give them the grace of actually seeing them as a real person in front of you, is what's the way we do that? Do we do that with love in our hearts, right? Or do we do it with a sense of fear or a desire to avoid that reality of that interaction with that person who's in front of us? I saw a hand. Was Lisa, did you want to say something? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yep. This is not easy stuff, right? That is our first reaction, is not to turn the other cheek. It's a taught behavior. It's a trained behavior. It's by witnessing Jesus and others who did it and watching what happens in the world because they did it, right? Think about the nonviolent movement, right? The civil rights movement, the way it changed the world wasn't by engaging in what people expected. It was by doing the unexpected and showing the possibility of what love could look like in the world. This stuff is hard. It seems hard because it is hard. And we need to talk about it over and over again because that's the truth of it. Following Jesus is something that calls something out of us, right? If we admit that we need to be transformed more into Jesus' likeness, it's because we're not Jesus, right? And that transformation requires from us an intention and a desire to live in the way that Jesus is putting forward, even in knowing we're not going to do it perfectly. But maybe it all begins in part by acknowledging we're not doing it perfectly, right? That there's that part of me that doesn't want to turn the other cheek. There's that part of me that doesn't want to give to the person who's there. And that's when we really let God in, when we admit that part of ourselves is truly in there, and that we want God to somehow help us find another way, in a new way. Beth, you had your hand, or Charles? Mm-hmm. Sure. I think it's a question we can hold. I don't have an answer. I think it is meeting people where they are. And there's a way in which giving people something to do to earn money, it can be a gift, right? A lot of people come and they don't want to be given something. So, I mean, I'm not Jesus, and I'm not going to tell you whether it is or not. I think it's a good question, but it seems to me a faithful way of trying to live that message out. So, Beth, I saw you up there. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I think it's a great point. It's the question of, when we engage with people who are described as toxic people, what happens to us and the communities we're a part of, and how do we do it in a way that's healthy and doesn't allow our own health to be put at risk as a consequence of that? And obviously there aren't perfect answers, but for me, one of the reasons I'm grateful for communities of faith like this is we share that work together, right? And as a community, I think we're healthier than we can be on our own, and communities have their own toxicity sometimes, and individuals in them who are hurt and need help in different kinds of ways. That's true too. But something about turning to God as a community for me is a way for us to have the strength to engage with those relationships that are difficult in the rest of our lives, and to do so with faith, and not to simply avoid it, right? There's a similar pattern in the life of the church where a couple of my mentors, and I followed this advice. You'll see why I say that in a moment. Have said to me in my life, Kevin, as you're looking at churches to go to be called to, be really careful, right? Don't go to a church that's really not doing very well, right? Don't go to a broken church, as they might put it, and have to feel like you have to fix it and sort of, and because, it's really hard to be in those contexts, not healthy for your family, right? And then you think to yourself, well, who's going to go to those churches then, right? If not the people who have the health to really help them through the challenge in their life and where they are. Luckily, I know this was not a place like that when I came, and I was called to a church that had much going for it that was wonderful and good. But I've also been aware there's lots of churches that are a lot more broken, and don't we need healthy clergy and healthy people to join those churches, not just find the ones that are doing well, so we can all be a part of supporting one another in our challenges. There's a lot more to say about this, and I appreciate the conversation, and I'm glad you've jumped in the deep water with me of trying this new way of engaging in preaching, and we certainly won't do it every week, but some weeks I think it's a useful thing, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that came out that I wouldn't have directly addressed in my words itself necessarily. The last thing I want to share with you, though, is about the last line, because I think it's really important in our world to pay attention to. This idea about perfection, right? Because I think as a culture, we're also really we get obsessed with being perfect. Everything's got to be right. And so on top of being told to love our enemies and give away our clothes and go the extra mile, here Jesus tells us we have to be perfect too, right? It's almost like pull out the whatever hair I have left as I try to figure out what that looks like. But I found in reading the commentary something really useful in my own reading of the passage and my own sense of where God was leading me in my life that helped me make sense of it, which is to be aware of the sort of context of that word perfect and the way it doesn't fully translate our intention into English, its intention into English. It's connected to the Greek word, which is telos, which is really when they're talking about that word, what they mean is it's what it's made for, its purpose, its goal, right? So think about a seed, right? What is a seed supposed to do? Not just be a seed. It's supposed to grow into something, right? Either a flower or a tree, whatever it's a seed of. And so when we're thinking about this moment where we're being called to be perfect, we're being called to be perfect like a seed is perfect. A seed is perfect by growing into what it's meant to be, not simply by being in that moment what it's meant to be, right? So the perfection we're being invited into, that fullness of life that Jesus showed us the way of, right, is what we're meant for and what God is inviting us to grow into. And yet, we can also be in a position where we recognize that we're not there yet. And this period of growth and transformation we're engaged in as we pray with one another and we seek to hear the holy words in Scripture and let them transform us is a process, right? It's not something that there's a period and it's done and we must be it now at all times. So if we're engaged in the process of that growth, then we're living into the kind of perfection which the word in Greek would be alluding to. So I wanted to make sure to share that with you because I think it's a really useful thing for us to hold on to. And so today, ultimately, how do we know when we're on this path that God has set us? How do we know if we're following the way that Jesus teaches about on that Sermon on the Mountain? I leave with you a quote which for me really sort of hones in on it. This is really all about understanding what it means to love, right? All of this is ways of Jesus pushing us to see what does love really look like in the world. That is the rubric by which we determine the faith that we're on, whether we're living a faithful life. St. John of the Cross, in fact, goes so far to say this. He says, in the evening we will be judged on love. And maybe now, having engaged with this passage of Scripture, struggled with our own limits to love in very real ways, we might have a little bit clearer idea of what it looks like to live just that kind of life, a life of love and care for others, and that we might do it to God's glory and in His name. Amen. Continues tonight in 3